What the Syrian Kurds are exposed to at the hands of Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, after President Donald Trump abandoned their protection, is not new in the history of the Kurds, nor in the history of their movement distributed on the map of the region. A history of betrayals that struck them from all sides. In Syria, they were the victims of the Ba'athist regime, which crushed them in the name of its Arab slogans, then used them through the loyalty of the Kurdistan Workers Party, in which the late President Hafez al-Assad found his opportunity to blackmail neighboring countries and his international opponents. And when the Turkish state threatened him with an invasion, he threw Abdullah Öcalan to a grim fate, and the man ended up in an isolated prison on İmralı Island in the Sea of Marmara. And in Iraq, their situation was no better at the hands of Saddam Hussein, who was uncomfortable using chemical weapons against their children. The Kurds were exposed to historical injustice that prevented them from establishing a state for them during the mapping stage. They were subjected to the oppression of the regimes that they had always tried to reconcile with, hoping to find an opportunity to fulfill their dream, but the stab wounds in their backs were not late. They were also victims of wrong calculations and bets most of the time. In the regional war with ISIS, the Kurdish forces were at the forefront of the fighters who liberated their Kurdish majority cities in northern Syria, but they also helped liberate Arab cities, such as Raqqa, one of the capitals of the terrorist organization, and released the Yazidi prisoners and captives from the grip of the criminals ISIS. In Sinjar, northwestern Iraq. And when their job ended, and the fruit-picking period came, as they thought, they found themselves again in front of the strong and weak equation that always ruled their fate. And here they are now facing an unknown fate in northern Syria, while they are on the road to displacement again. On this page of issues, we highlight the situation of the Kurds in Syria and Turkey, in light of the campaign that Erdogan launches against them under the pretext of fighting terrorism. The biggest concern of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk and his companions, after the War of Liberation that they waged shortly after the end of the First World War, was the loss of more lands by their fledgling state due to the national revolutions that helped overthrow the Ottoman state. It seemed to them that the bond of religion upon which the Ottoman Caliphate was based did not prevent Muslims in various parts of the world from revolting against the state and demanding independence from it. Therefore, Ataturk imposed a strong and strict regime in modern Turkey, cutting between the new state and its old legacy, so the decision to drop the caliphate, the use of Latin letters, and the secular system came to fuse all citizens in the Turkish Republic into one melting pot, one culture, one nation, and one language, in order to prevent any separatism based on race or religion. This nationalist orientation seemed to be understood by the companions of Ataturk's path, but he never convinced the Islamists or the Kurds who promised that the founder of the Republic and the leader of the Liberation War had deceived them. He did not reveal any of his future plans to them when he toured various Turkish cities, asking for their support for him in a war. Editing. The Kurds participated in this war, thinking that the goal is to liberate the caliphate and restore its rule, not to establish a new state on its ruins that does not recognize the existence of a Kurdish nationalism, even if the Kurds constitute about 20% of its population. Part of the religious Kurds abandoned their support for the Sèvres Agreement, which saw the establishment of a Kurdish state, in order to participate in the Liberation War, in the hope of the return of the Islamic Caliphate, but they found themselves ruled by a nation-state that raises the Turkish flag, whose only official language is Turkish. There have been some Kurdish revolutions in southeastern Turkey since the declaration of the modern republic in 1923, but the army was able to suppress them all. For decades, the Kurdish language remained prohibited, whether in education or even in daily use. There are no Kurdish newspapers, songs, or poems, and this helped to assimilate an important part of the Kurds into Turkish society, so that it became common for people to be surprised by a politician, artist, or athlete who gained fame. And then it becomes clear that he is of Kurdish origins. Those who have integrated into Turkish society found their future to belong to it, and to abandon the past of their fathers, especially since most of the Kurds who were born and lived in the major cities did not learn Kurdish at all. Abdullah Öcalan, leader of the Kurdistan Workers Party, was the first to call for the restoration of the Kurdish identity, and to distinguish it from Turkish nationalism, as he led an armed leftist movement against the state system and military guardianship, which suppressed all ideological trends during the 1980 coup. Leaders of political and ideological movements led to severe torture, and even murder, in prisons during the coup. Öcalan found in the Kurdish national factor a strong ammunition in order to incite his movement to revolt against the ruling regime and the military tutelage. The grievances of the military coup helped expand the scope of this movement, the speed of the spread of its ideas and the number of its adherents. This armed insurrection, which the PKK has led since 1984, bloodied the Turkish state, especially since the Workers' Party received quick support from a number of regional countries, such as Syria and Iran, Western countries, and Russia, to the point that Turkish President at the time Turgut Özal seriously thought of accepting the party's demands for self-rule in southeastern Turkey, and some say that Özal paid with his life for this approach, as he mysteriously passed away months after he indirectly communicated with Öcalan through mediators. Also, regional interventions prevented Turkey from reaching political solutions with Kurdistani, because these interventions thwarted ceasefire attempts by pushing elements of the party to carry out surprise attacks. The Kurdish movement retreated dramatically after the United States kidnapped Abdullah Öcalan and handed him over to Turkey in 1999, but the nationalist movement that was controlling Turkey at the time prevented it from seizing the opportunity of this great military victory, in order to provide a political solution that ends this conflict. Turkey waited until the Justice and Development Party began peace negotiations, the first of its kind, with Abdullah Öcalan in his prison in 2013. But these negotiations also failed due to the internal political interests of then Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and the resurgence of regional interference, especially Iran. While Turkey has achieved important military victories against the PKK, with US support in the last decade, the unrest in Syria has allowed Kurdish militants to find a safe haven for them, instead of the Kandil Mountains in northern Iraq or southeastern Turkey. Politically, Turkey realizes that without solving the Kurdish issue, it cannot fulfill its dreams of being a regional or international and economic power, and that if it had succeeded in solving its Kurdish issue internally, it would today be controlling northern Syria and northern Iraq, and put pressure on Iran as well, if it succeeded in converting the Kurds from an enemy to an ally. But the nationalist trend that controls the feelings of the Turks, which is fed by the power of President Erdogan, prevents this, because the price, in the opinion of this current, to turn the Kurds into allies, is their demand for self-rule, which paves the way for a future demand for an independent state that seizes a third of the territory of the Turkish Republic. The Kurds in Turkey today are divided into two main currents. The first trend is supportive of the PKK's demands for self-rule, similar to what the Kurds got in Iraq. The second is the religious trend that accepts the current situation, demands cultural reforms within the borders of the Turkish nation-state, and joins those Kurds who have assimilated into Turkish society. They say that there are more Kurds in Istanbul today than there are Kurds in Diyarbakir. Therefore, the idea of autonomy becomes meaningless here. On the other hand, the first current, supported by weapons, insists on sharing sovereignty with the Turks on the land of the Republic, with constitutional recognition of the existence of Kurdish nationalism, and the promise of Kurdish as an official language, with autonomy in southeastern Turkey, that can join in a confederation with its counterpart in northern Syria and northern Iraq, according to a political prescription developed by Öcalan, which some see as nothing more than a form of political imagination. Accordingly, Turkey, since 1999, has remained at a strategic crossroads. The West calls on it to reach an agreement with the Kurds and turn their armed organizations into allies, in order to turn Turkey into a strong regional state, while the nationalist interior rejects this and insists on the continuation of the Turkish nation-state. The Kurds at home appear divided. The Kurdish parties loyal to the approach of self-rule and armed action win the votes of only half of Turkey's Kurds, while the second half insists on voting for Turkish parties of various orientations, led by the ruling Justice and Development Party, because of religious ties. As long as this division still exists within Turkey, it will inevitably be reflected in Ankara's relationship with the Syrian Kurds, and regional Kurdish movements. If Turkey had managed to get rid of the complex of national revolutions and calls for secession, and formed an alliance with the Kurds in general, it would have naturally expanded in northern Syria, and it would have been their biggest ally, instead of Washington. But as long as President Erdogan's interest remains with the strengthening of the nationalist movement he votes for, any Kurdish activity in the vicinity of Turkey, especially in Syria, will pose a threat to the existing political system in Turkey, especially since the dominant political current that dominates Syria's Kurds carries ideas and slogans. The PKK itself, and its leader Öcalan, differs from the pragmatic political currents of northern Iraq that accept that its future and dreams remain under the tutelage of regional states. What the Syrian Kurds are exposed to at the hands of Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, after President Donald Trump abandoned their protection, is not new in the history of the Kurds, nor in the history of their movement distributed on the map of the region. A history of betrayals that struck them from all sides. In Syria, they were the victims of the Ba'athist regime, which crushed them in the name of its Arab slogans, then used them through the loyalty of the Kurdistan Workers Party, in which the late President Hafez al-Assad found his opportunity to blackmail neighboring countries and his international opponents. And when the Turkish state threatened him with an invasion, he threw Abdullah Öcalan to a grim fate, and the man ended up in an isolated prison on Imrali Island in the Sea of Marmara. And in Iraq, their situation was no better at the hands of Saddam Hussein, who was uncomfortable using chemical weapons against their children. The Kurds were exposed to historical injustice that prevented them from establishing a state for them during the mapping stage. They were subjected to the oppression of the regimes that they had always